Live. So good morning, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And we are so excited you guys are all joining us today. Right now, we've got 4 classes from across North America. So I'm going to give them a chance to do a bit of a shout out before we dive in with our speaker. So we have Miss Erickson's grade 4s in Madison in Wisconsin. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hey, welcome in. We've got Miss Malco's grade 2s in Hobart in Wisconsin. Hi, guys. So many of you. Oh, let's get your mic demuted. It wants to work. You're there. You're excited. Even if my mic won't work for unmute you, that's okay. We hear your enthusiasm from across the country. We've got Miss Rambaran's grade 5/6s in Toronto, Ontario. Hi, guys. Hey, we got a special shout out to the G.O.A.T today. Some product placement is wicked. All right, and last but not least, Miss Olson's group. They are joining in Rochester, Minnesota, grade 5s. Now they already are here. Perfect. Hey guys, welcome in. It's not letting me do anything. Hey, man, everyone has couches in classes nowadays. I never had a couch in my class. I had to walk uphill both ways in the snow. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us today, guys. Of course, the reason you're all here is for our speakers. We are joined live in Canada's capital in beautiful Ottawa by Peter Soroye. So he is a climate change and pollinator specialist. So pollinators, all those insects, all those animals that keep our flowers healthy, keep our ecosystems healthy, well, they're under threat from habitat loss, from climate change and other things. So Peter wants to understand what's happening, how we can solve it, and he's interested in a lot of other stuff too. So I'm not going to take any more of his thunder. Without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Peter, and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm going to share this screen, get that going. And how does that look? Can everyone see? Everyone's good? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Perfect. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for having me. Thank you, Jesse. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I'm really excited to talk to you guys, to answer your questions after. Like Jesse said, I'm Peter. I'm a PhD student at the University of Ottawa. And I'm really excited to talk about climate change and pollinators and a little bit at the end of how you guys can help save the world. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of an introduction. This is me, Peter. University of Ottawa is at that little red dot. So not too far from New York or Vermont. I'm not sure how far it is from Wisconsin, maybe a little bit of a trek, but everyone in Ontario knows where it is pretty well, probably. So I'm a PhD student, and I've been in school for probably 20 years now, which is a really long time. But at this point, when I'm doing a PhD, it really doesn't feel like school. There's not a lot of tests, not a lot of exams. Instead, what I do is research. So I ask questions and I think of theories of how the world works and what's going on in it. And then I collect data and I do experiments and analyses to test these ideas and these theories. And so a lot of my work ends up being on the computer, and I look at impacts of climate change and impacts on pollinators across huge scales. But every now and then I get to take a break from the computer and I get to go to really exotic places like South Africa or Arizona or Scotland. And I get to talk about my research, or I get to collect data and get in the field and look at bees and butterflies and other cool things. But that's enough about me. I'm going to hop into the talk. But before I do, I just want to start by saying I'm a scientist, but I'm also a regular person. So I enjoy sandwiches and basketball, go Raptors, and music. But one thing I like more than all of these other things is planet Earth, this big, beautiful blue dot that we all live on. I'm sure you're very familiar with it. I hope you're pretty familiar with it. And what really fascinates me about the planet Earth is the diversity and the complexity of life on this planet, especially on the green parts of the planet. Because I can't swim, so I stay away from the ocean mostly. But the stuff that goes on land is just so incredibly complex and so incredibly fascinating. And to prove that, all you need to do is kind of, open up Netflix or pop in a DVD of Planet Earth, and you can hear David Attenborough tell you about things like the three-toed sleuth or marine iguanas of Galapagos Islands. That was my best David Attenborough impression. I won't do it again. But you don't need to let David Attenborough tell you about the planet Earth to see how cool it is. all you really have to do is step outside. And so if you're in Ottawa or Ontario like me, then it's a little snowy and a little cold right now, but give it a few weeks. And if you're further south, you might already be in this stage. But if you go out in the forest, you know, in the springtime, you'll start to see something like this. So you'll see these beautiful big hardwood trees, just starting to have buds of leaves that will, you know, eventually form the canopy. And on the floor, on the ground of these forests, you'll see these really beautiful carpets of really bright flowers. And this will be things like trilliums and Solomon seal, really, really gorgeous, colorful carpets of flowers along the forest floor. And these flowers are what we call spring ephemerals. They're ephemeral means that they disappear really quickly. And so these flowers in the springtime, they come out really early. Some of them come out when there's still snow on the ground. And by the time the summer comes around and people start exploring outside, a lot of these flowers are already gone. So they're very ephemeral. They disappear very quickly, but they're very beautiful, a very beautiful part of life on this earth. And of course, later in the summer, if you want to see kind of the diversity and complexity of on the planet, you can take a walk into a meadow or a field, and you can see these huge fields of grasses, which might not look super interesting, but I promise you, if you take a minute and you take a look at these grasses in just a really small square of 1 meter by 1 meter, you can have tens or dozens of different species and different types of grass. And they might look different. They might look all the same from far away, but when you get up close, you can start to see that they're all really different and really cool. And of course, mixed in with those grasses, these really bright splashes of color from flowers like black-eyed Susans and other paintbrush flowers and different really, really colorful, really bright flowers, really beautiful. And of course, those are kind of some really, you know, forested environments and meadows where we expect to see a lot of beauty. But even in the harshness of Canada's northern territories, places like Nunavut, where it's really cold for most of the year, in the summer, these places completely transform, and you have carpets of flowers all across, really bright, really beautiful, that really you might not expect to see in kind of these really remote, really northern and harsh environments. And of course, outside of Canada, in deserts, places where you might think are really barren and don't have a lot of diversity. Of course, if you go at the right time of the year, these deserts are bursting with life. So they have so many plants and animals, and of course, so many beautiful flowers, and just tapestries of gorgeous splashes of color across them. And of course, so I've been focusing a lot, or I've showed a lot of pictures of kind of these landscapes and these habitats and the flowers and plants that make them up. But of course, there are a lot of animals that make up the life on Earth as well, right? And so around Ottawa or in Ontario and Canada, you might be familiar with a lot of these, everything from bear to moose to small rabbits and butterflies and praying mantises, a lot of insects and mammals and birds, of course, that live inside these environments. And as an ecologist, for me as a scientist, these animals are what's really exciting, or really is exciting. And these animals and these plants, and particularly the interactions that they take a part of together. And so the interaction not only between species and between birds and moose, for example, or bears and moose, but also the interactions between these organisms and their environment. So at every moment in time, all of these organisms, and you and me, are always interacting with our environment. When things get too hot, we like to find some shade. When things get too cold, we like to bundle up and keep warm. And so every organism is always interacting with this environment and is always using various strategies and behaviors to cope with this environment in different ways. And of course, these organisms are interacting with each other as well. And you might be able to spot a few examples of these interactions in this photo. And so I'm going to point out a few that you might be familiar with. One of them that we talk about a lot, or that we hear about a lot, is herbivory. So this rabbit is kind of chomping down on these flowers. This moose is walking through a field of, I think, lupins and, you know, munching down here or there. This is an example of an interaction between a herbivore and eating its food source of different plants, other organisms. Some other interactions that we see a lot in the wild are things like competition. And so here in this little picture, this bear is hovering over or standing over a bunch of different flowers. And so you can see a lot of different species of flower in this group. And they're all competing against each other in the wild. So nobody is going out in the wild and watering each one of these plants or feeding each one of these plants. Instead, there's a limited amount of resources that they have to compete for. So when it rains or when there's some nutrients in the soil, all of these plants is out on their own. It's a free-for-all. They need to compete against each other to make sure they have what they need to grow. And so competition is a really important set of interactions that go on in the wild. Another interaction that we don't really talk about too much, but that you can see here, is kind of the interaction between a species and its habitat. And so here we have this praying mantis who's perched on a flower again, and they're waiting for some bug to fly by, and they're just going to snap out and grab that bug and have a nice dinner. And so in this case, this praying mantis isn't really interacting too much with the plant, but it's using this plant as a camouflage, as a habitat. And so this is another important set of interactions. And finally, the one that probably you're most interested in, and I'm definitely most interested in, is pollination. And pollination is a set of interactions that is the backbone of a lot of life on Earth. You notice that in a lot of the pictures that I used already, there were a lot of plants in these pictures, a lot of flowers. And pollination is kind of essential for all of these landscapes that I've shown before. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this right now. So pollination, you might already be familiar with what it is, but basically pollination is the transfer of pollen from one flower to another flower. And so plants have a lot of different parts, a lot of different pieces that goes into them. And in every flower they have one structure called an anther, which is going to produce pollen or contain pollen. And then they're going to have another structure called the stigma. And this part is going to receive pollen. And so you need to have pollen go from one of these to the other one for the flower to be able to make a seed and reproduce. And if the flower can't reproduce and make a seed, it's not going to make fruit either. So this pollination, this transfer of pollen between flowers, is essential for plants. Without being pollinated, they won't reproduce. They won't have fruits or seeds, and they won't keep on continuing year after year after year. And so there are a lot of different methods of pollination. One of them that some flowers do is either self-pollination or wind pollination. And so for a lot of plants like wheat or corn, a lot of some crops, grasses, or things like ragweed, or a lot of trees, these plants and flowers, they don't need to be pollinated by an animal transferring the pollen. Instead, what they'll do is they'll make a whole bunch of pollen and they'll just throw it into the wind. And they'll hope that the wind will carry one of these grains of pollen and float it through the air and land on another flower. And that will reproduce, and that will allow it to reproduce. And so for these plants that are wind pollinated or self-pollinating, they just kind of release huge bunches of pollen. And it works some of the time. Most of the time, these plants are really successful. And you're probably really familiar with it, especially if you have seasonal allergies. So people who in the springtime start to get their sinuses blocked up, start really sneezing a lot of the times, this is the result of a lot of these wind pollinating plants just releasing huge bunches of really tiny pollen. And that pollen ended up starting to irritate our lungs and our sinuses in different ways. So you might be really familiar with these wind pollinating plants, and you may not be huge fans of them if you have allergies. But another set of plants and another set of pollination that you probably really like, that I definitely really like, is animal pollination. Definitely no complaints here. So in this case of pollination for these plants can't be pollinated on their own. They can't throw a bunch of seeds into the wind and hope that they land on another flower of their same species. Instead, what they do is rely on different animals. And these animals, these pollinators, these can be bees like bumblebees in this picture, or they can be butterflies or moths, or flies even, like houseflies you might see around your house, or a lot of birds and bats as well. A lot of these animals and a huge amount of other animals like beetles, and even some mammals, are really important pollinators for plants that require animals to move pollen from one flower to another. And so about 75 to 95% of all flowering plants in the world need help with pollination from some animal or another. And of course, it's not just flowers and plants in the wild, it's also a lot of the crops that we like to eat. So some crops like corn or wheat, I mentioned before, these are wind pollinated. And so they don't need animals. But a lot of the plants that we eat, a lot of the crops that we eat, things like vegetables and tomatoes, and, fruits, a lot of berries and nuts, these things need animals to pollinate them. And so without them, without animals, without pollinators, we don't have a lot of these colorful fruits and nutritious veggies and kind of hardy nuts. And so you can imagine without animal pollinators pollinating a lot of the crops that we need, we would have spaghetti, but with no tomato sauce. So we'd just be eating bare noodles all the time. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm not a fan of just bare noodles. I need that tomato sauce. That's why I love pollinators. So some of the best pollinators that we have are bumblebees. And these are the most adorable and the cutest insects of all time. They're huge, they're big, they're fuzzy. You've probably seen them in the summer or in the springtime. And you would have seen them, you probably would have heard them before you even see them because they're so big, they're so loud. And so you can hear them from quite a while away, but they're really gentle. They do sting you like a lot of other bees, but as long as you're not kind of throwing them around or being rude to them, then they're really quite gentle animals and you can get quite close to them. And bumblebees are really great pollinators. And they're actually very different from other bees that you might be familiar with, like honeybees. So honeybees are often the first bee that comes to people's mind. Honeybees are where we get honey, and they make these great hexagon-shaped honeycombs, and they're raised in these hives of thousands or tens of thousands of bees. But honeybees are really unique. Honeybees originally are from parts of Europe, but now essentially honeybees are like farm animals. People raise them in these hives and they bring them to different places. They're brought all across North America to pollinate different crops, which they do really well, but they're not native to our ecosystems here. And so they're not suited as well to pollinating a lot of the native crops to here, like squashes and berries. And honeybees are also not that great at pollinating kind of wild landscapes. So while honeybees are super important and they're really cool, they have nothing on bumblebees, especially in kind of the cuteness aspect. Bumblebees are just much more adorable as well than honeybees. And that's very important. But so these bumblebees are also really cool because they're really big and fuzzy, and so they can keep heat inside them really well. And this means that they can come out really early in the spring and they can stay out really late into the fall. And so earlier in this talk, I was talking about those spring ephemerals, those beautiful carpets of flowers that you might see if you go out into a forest really early in the spring. And these flowers, these depend on bumblebees. There's no other pollinator that comes out so early in the springtime when it's still chilly and there might even still be snow on the ground to pollinate these flowers. So bumblebees are really well suited to pollinating in North America and Europe in these temperate environments. But unfortunately, they're disappearing. In a matter of decades, in the last few decades, the amount of bumblebees that we notice when we go out to search for them is becoming fewer and fewer. And this is because of a lot of different things. One of these things is pesticide use. So pesticides are really important for a lot of our crops to keep the bad bugs off, the pest bugs that we don't want, that are going to ruin our flowers, our crops and our fruits and vegetables. Pesticides are necessary for keeping those pests away. But when we use pesticides too much, or when we use them a little recklessly, then they leach into the surrounding environment. And pesticides are built to kill insects, and bumblebees are insects. And so when these pesticides leach out into the surrounding environment, it has a pretty negative effect on other pollinators like bumblebees that might be in these surrounding environments. Another thing that is causing bumblebees to disappear on the world is habitat loss and land use change. So when we clear out a meadow or a forest to put in a field of soy or corn, this is good for us. We need food, but this takes away a lot of habitat for bumblebees. A lot of the habitats that they'll use to forage for food, or to find nests, or to overwinter when they find dens for the winter. This destroys a lot of the habitat that they need for that, and this isn't that great for them. The other thing that drives a lot of these bumblebees to disappear is climate change. So you might be familiar with climate change and how it works. You might be familiar that as we drive our cars and as we heat our homes and we have factories that pump out carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, you might be familiar with how these greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide or methane are trapped in the atmosphere of our beautiful blue planet. And these gases get trapped in the atmosphere and they increase the temperature. And so summers are getting warmer and warmer, winters are getting milder and milder, and overall the average temperature is warming across the globe. But the other thing that climate change does, and that we notice probably a lot more without realizing it, is climate change increases the frequency and the severity of extreme events. So not only does climate change make summers a little bit warmer and a little bit warmer every year, but climate change also makes heat waves happen more and more frequently. So there are more heat waves, and these heat waves, when they happen, are more severe. So they're getting worse and worse. And the same thing with droughts. They make droughts happen more often and last a lot longer. And the funny thing about climate change is it also does it on the other end as well. So climate change makes extremes in precipitation, like extreme rainfall, also happen more and more. So in places like Ottawa, where we're on the border of a river, we end up having more and more flooding as a result of climate change as well. So one thing that climate change does is increases extreme events, and it looks like this is having a huge impact on bumblebees. They're really well suited to coping with colder temperatures and chilly environments, but when it comes to extreme heat waves for long periods of time, they're just not able to handle it as well. And so this is one thing that is driving bumblebees to disappear across a lot of the globe. And so this makes for some really sad bumblebees. They're not doing very well because of climate change and habitat loss and pesticides. And this isn't very good. But I mentioned at the very start that I wasn't only going to talk about climate change and pollinators, I was also going to talk about how you guys could save the world a little bit. And so that's what I'm going to talk about for a few more minutes. So one of the things you can do that is really helpful for bumblebees and for other pollinators and for our wild landscapes even more generally is creating pollinator gardens. So this is one thing you can do in your own backyard or your front yard or wherever you want. What a pollinator garden is it's a garden, but it's full of native flowers, of wildflowers. The same things you would go out and see when you're taking a hike in the woods. This is what you want to be planting in your pollinator garden. And so what it does is it provides a lot of food and habitat for these native pollinators, things like bumblebees and butterflies and hummingbirds. It gives them a stopping over point, a refuge that they can find even in the middle of the city, a little pit stop they can use. And if you incorporate a lot of diversity of habitats, keeping things like leaf litter or fallen logs on the ground as well in these pollinator gardens, then this gives these animals little refuges as well. So when things start to get really hot for them, they can take shelter in these. And when they need places to overwinter for the winter, then they have that as well. Of course, to stop climate change is a really important thing as well if we want to stop these declines. And so one thing you can do here at a personal level is to keep being environmentally sustainable and environmentally friendly. Drive less, fly less, eat less meat, recycle. You kind of know the drill. There's a lot of really cool things that you can do that would be really important. We have a really beautiful planet that we live on. And because of climate change and habitat loss, a lot of it is under threat. But there are a lot of things that you guys can do to help save not only this planet, but bees as well. And you can make for some really happy pollinators and for some really happy bumblebees. And so on that note, I'm going to open it up to you guys, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions that you might have as best as I can. Thanks for listening.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that, Peter. What a great tour of all the work you're doing in pollinators, and we end with a happy bumblebee. And how do you beat that? So this is the cutest insect in the world. So in addition to our 4 classes we started with, we did have Miss Mayberry and Miss Kelly's class join us in Nashville, North Carolina, and Miss Huxley's join us in Brampton. So welcome to you guys. We also have a bunch of groups watching on YouTube Live. So if you guys want to type in questions in the chat bar, please do, and we'll take as many as we can. Peter, if you just want to come out of screen share, that would be awesome. And then we will head to Miss Erickson's class to kick us off for a first question. So come on up, Miss Erickson's group, if you guys want to kick us off.
Hey, you guys, it's your turn.
Hi, my name is Karen. I have a question. What happens if there's no more bees?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. So if we have no more bees, then we don't have a lot more we don't have any pollination, or the pollination that we have is not nearly as good. So without bumblebees, for example, bumblebees are really cool because they're so big, and because they vibrate so at such a high frequency, and they're so loud, or such a low frequency. These bees, when they land on flowers, they shake off the pollen. So smaller pollinators like honeybees or butterflies, when they land on a flower, the reason they get pollen on them is because they're kind of digging around the flower. they're like rustling around, and so a lot of pollen gets stuck on there. But when bumblebees land on a flower, they shake off the pollen. And so there's some plants like tomato plants, like squashes and berries, a lot of crops that we eat that are really tasty and really nutritious. They need bumblebees to pollinate. And so without wild bees like bumblebees, then we lose a lot of the flavor and color on our plates from these crops.
Fantastic. That's a great question to kick us off. No pressure at all, Peter. All right, let's head to Ms. Malco's class. In fact, we might take two from you guys because there's like 850 kids in that class. So we'll start with one and then we'll come right back for a second, okay?
Okay, go ahead, buddy.
How much time does a bee have to take pollen from one flower?
Ooh, how much time does it take?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and it depends a lot. It depends a lot on the flower. It depends a lot on the bee. So it varies quite a bit. But flowers are designed over millions and millions of years of evolution evolving beside these bees. These flowers have adapted different ways to kind of trick bees and other pollinators into pollinating them. Because these pollinators, they aren't pollinating these flowers for the flower's benefit. No. All these pollinators are doing it because what they want is nectar. And so these flowers produce nectar, which is really sweet. It's like honey almost. And so a lot of these pollinators fly in and they know that these flowers have nectar. And so when they try to get the nectar, the flowers make sure that the pollen sticks onto these animals. And so when these animals fly off and they go to another flower to get more nectar, and they land on the flower, and all of the pollen that was stuck on them from the other flower ends up going onto this new flower. And so these flowers are tricking these pollinators into pollinating them. And so some of them do this in really simple ways, and others do it in really complex ways. And all of that is going to affect how much time it takes for them to be pollinated.
Yeah. One thing you can do, which I mean, you mentioned a lot in your talk, is for kids, go out in spring, go out in summer and see how fast bees are going between flowers. And they're quite different from one another and other insects too. So it's a fun experiment you can do at home. All right, Ms. Malco's group, let's come right back to you guys and then we'll keep going through the list.
Okay, we're not sure if you'll know the answer to this, but we don't know unless we ask. Nice and loud.
Can bees stop people from getting allergic to pollen?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I don't know the answer. I'm sorry. But that's a really, really cool question.
That is, well, we love questions where there's not a ready answer because it means that there's lots of science still out there to do. So maybe when you have done school for 20 years, which I know sounds forbidding now, but it means you get to do really cool jobs like Peter's, you can find out the answer for us. And we'll do another one of these in like 20 years as a follow-up and check in with you. Let's head to Miss Rambaran's class. If you guys want to come on up, go for it.
Who or what inspired you to start studying climate change and pollinators?
Oh, that's a great question. I think for me, so I grew up in Northern Ontario, and my grandpa used to take me out camping all the time. And so we would go out and we'd spend a lot of time in the outdoors and canoeing and kind of seeing, how beautiful all these natural environments were. And at the same time, I was always kind of flipping through National Geographic magazines and watching these wildlife documentaries. And so it really inspired me to kind of find out more about the beautiful world that we live in and how cool it was. And a big reason was that I knew if I was studying it, then I would get a free ticket to go and look at it. So that was a big thing as well. But then it became really clear to me that climate change and habitat loss and a lot of things that humans are doing to the environment are destroying it and are making things disappear from it. And so it was really important for me to try to figure out ways that we can stop this and prevent it from happening. So I think that's what inspired me to kind of do this.
Fantastic. It's a question we get for a lot of our speakers, and I always like when people highlight the fact that it's simply going outside, or it's reading books, or it's watching documentaries. I mean, these are things that every kid in every one of these classrooms can do the moment they're done. And we will pass along some resources so you can find out more and keep the learning going. Great question, guys. Ms. Olson's group, if you guys want to come up, go for it.
Population has decreased.
What was the first part of that?
How much of the bee population has decreased?
Yeah, question.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. So recently I just did some research on that. And what I found was that across all of North America and across all of Europe, the likelihood of going out to find a bee today versus 50 years ago, for example, the likelihood of actually finding a bee when you went out to go look was about a third lower. And so some of these species, this was a lot higher for some species. Some of them almost completely disappeared from the earth, which is really worrying. Other species are still managing to do really well, but on average, the likelihood of finding these bees in a lot of spots is about a third lower. And so this is a really, really severe and kind of really worrying level of decline in a really short time period. But like I said, there are a lot of things we can do to prevent these moving forward. A lot of the things that you guys can do even today to kind of try and stop these declines.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, let's head to Asheville, Miss Kelly's group. If you guys have a question, come on up.
Why are pollinators so small?
Why are they so small, Peter?
Oh,
Great question.
that's a good question, and I think it has to do with the flowers that they pollinate. And so flowers in general are pretty small, right? And so for bees, for pollinators, like bees or like flies, to be able to go into these flowers and get that nectar that they want, then these animals have to be pretty small. But actually, there's some pollinators that are really big. Some bats, for example, some birds. A lot of these organisms can be, pretty sizable as well. And so it really depends on the type of flowers that they're trying to pollinate.
Yeah, great question, guys. All right, let's end with Miss Huxley's group, and then we'll do a whole other round as we're whipping through these. So Miss Huxley's class, come on up.
How old do bees live? How long do bees live?
Yeah, good question. So that depends on the bee as well. So for honeybees, for example, honeybees live in those hives that you might be familiar with. And so people keep them in these hives over the whole winter. And so the queens of those hives, I think, can live for actually a few years. And the workers generally live for only a year or some shorter time periods. But those queens can live up to a few years. For bumblebees, though, and for a lot of wild bees that we see in nature, these bees only ever live for 1 year. And so a new batch of them is born kind of at the end of the summer or in the fall. And then the queens that are born, they find a hiding place for the winter. So they find a den similar to like a bear who overwinters or hibernates for the winter. A bee is going to do a similar thing. So they're going to find a little den. They'll overwinter. In the spring, they wake up, they forage. The queens will start a new colony. The colony will live for the summer, and then the cycle restarts. At the end of the summer, they produce a new batch of queens, and they're going to look for dens, and the cycle continues. So for a lot of wild bees, they only live for 1 year. But other bees, like honeybees, the queens can live for a few.
I'm so glad that question got answered, because if a kid didn't ask it, I was going to ask it. So there you go. Let's head back to Miss Erickson's group. If you guys want to come up again, go for it. And by the way, for our YouTube groups, if anyone wants to tune in, ask a question, please do. Don't be shy. But yes, for now, Miss Erickson's group, student, come on up.
My name is Chance, and I was wondering, do bees have attackers like ants, or do all bees just sting?
Yeah.
Ooh, they have attack bees.
Well, so let's go back for a second. Do things attack bees? Is that the question? And then, or do they all prevent that because they have the stingers? Is that it, guys?
Mm-hmm.
So I know all bees will sting, but do they have like a certain breed of bees to sting just for defense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Cool question, Chance. And that's really cool question. So there are a few. So bees have a few predators, like wasps and even ants and stuff. And so a lot of these bees have those stingers to protect themselves from these organisms. And also, like bears and badgers will dig up bumblebee nests, and so the stingers help protect them from these animals who are going to dig up their nests. And there are, so bees you might be familiar with, they usually have queen bees and they have worker bees. And within these worker bees, often there's some kind of a division or like a hierarchy. And so some of these workers are more for foraging, they're more likely to go out and kind of collect pollen and nectar. But other workers are more kind of like homemakers. So they're going to stick around the hive and they're going to clean things up. They're going to fan it when it starts to get too warm. And they'll be around, so if an attacker comes by, they'll probably be the most likely to sting and defend the nest. Yeah.
Oh, great. All right, Miss Malco's group, come on up.
Introduce yourself
Hi.
really loud.
My name is Andrea and I have a question. How many capacity in bumblebees and honeybee have?
So Adrian is wondering what the capacity is. What can a honeybee and a bumblebee carry for pollen?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. And another one that I'm not entirely sure the answer to. I think it will depend a lot on, so pollen, the size of pollen can be quite different from flower to flower. So some flowers have really large pollen grains, others have much smaller pollen grains. And bees, bumblebees and honeybees can vary in size a little bit as well. So it would depend on the size and kind of the size of the bee and the size of the pollen. But it can be quite a lot. Sometimes you'll see bees and they're completely covered in pollen and it looks like they shouldn't even be able to fly. But they manage to do it anyway.
Yeah, I think that's the coolest takeaway of it is if you look at the pollen packages that these bees are carrying compared to like a person trying to carry that much, it would seem ridiculously high, right? Yeah. We got a question from our group on YouTube. So Mr. Backus's group, also in Rochester, Minnesota, wanted to ask, what is the total population of bees in the whole world, Peter?
Ooh, big question. In terms of the number of bees, I don't think I could come close to answering that. But in terms of the number of species of bees, there are over 20,000 different species of bees. So different kinds of bees around the planet. And honeybees is just one of those. Bumblebees, there are about a little over 250 different types of bumblebees around the world. But then there are a whole bunch of other types of bees, little sweat bees that they don't sting. They just like hunt around and they're really shiny and metallic colors. There are carpenter bees that will kind of nest in your decks a lot, which is kind of annoying because they punch in these huge holes where they overwinter. There are a lot of other solitary bees that will fly around and kind of do their thing and pollinate. So there are a huge amount of different species of bees, and if you were to count the number of them, you'd be counting for a really long time, I think.
Awesome. By the way, for sweat bees, because this has been mentioned in a few other things, these are little bees that come up and will literally land in you and drink your sweat. So if you picture like 100 little bees in your hand drinking the sweat, it's a really interesting experience, and a lot of researchers have highlighted it as being very cool. All right, Miss Olson's group, come on back up, guys. Thanks for the YouTube question before too. All right. Yeah, you're good to go.
Have a pollinator's garden.
Oh, come a little closer to the camera.
Do you have a pollinator's garden? No.
She said, do you have a pollinator garden?
Do you have pollinator gardens, Peter?
Oh, yeah. So at my parents' house, I do. I live in an apartment, so I don't really have the space, unfortunately. But at my parents', I made sure they made a nice big one. So.
Yeah. Is there an easy way to find out the native wildflowers that live near you? Is there a resource that kids can go to and say, okay, here's what should grow here? Or?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, there's usually, if you do a quick Google search for kind of your state or province or area and look for native or wildflowers, then you should be able to pretty quickly find a nice list of different wildflowers. And if you go visit kind of a conservation authority or their website or office, then they'll probably be able to tell you pretty quickly as well.
Fantastic. All right, we're going to take a few more questions. Let's head back to Miss Kelly's group. If you guys have one, come on up. Why do pollinators pollinate, Peter?
Oh, yeah. Awesome. So it really comes down, so pollinators, they aren't looking there. So pollination is kind of that transfer of pollen from one flower to another. And the pollinators, they aren't really trying to do that. What the pollinators are trying to do is get nectar from flowers. So nectar is like little speed, it's like really sugary juice, like speed juice or, apple juice that they're trying to get, or not apple juice, but like really sugary boost of energy from these flowers. And so these pollinators are flying around, they're just going to every flower and trying to drink as much of this nectar as possible. And so it just happens that these flowers have realized, hey, if we make a lot of this nectar, and they use it as kind of like bait. And so they say, hey, if we can have this nectar and we put it in this spot specifically of our flowers, then the bees are going to come by, or the pollinators are going to come by. They're going to drink the nectar. And while they do that, they'll get a whole load of pollen stuck on their forehead. And so when that pollinator leaves the flower and goes to another one to drink more nectar, it's going to stick its head back in the flower. And all the pollen that was on its forehead is now going to go into the flower. And so this flower has managed to pollinate, or has managed to transfer its pollen from one flower to a whole new one in its neighborhood.
Fantastic. All right, and then one last question, Miss Rambrand's class. Come on.
Please give me a call when you get a chance. Mackenzie, thank you.
What are you doing right now to help pollinators?
Yeah.
Ooh, yeah, great question. So I do a lot of research, like I mentioned, and I try to find different strategies that we can use. Like, for example, where is it best to make parks, or where is it best to make protected areas for these bees, so we can protect their habitat and figure out where they need us to intervene and either conserve them more actively with different actions, or protect the habitat that they need. So that's kind of what I do in my study. But on the regular basis, like I said, taking care of my parents' pollinator garden a little bit when I'm back home with them, and of course trying to act sustainably and reduce my carbon emissions on the day-to-day to help kind of address that as well.
Well, and education too. I mean, this talk in and of itself is an example of inspiring all you kids to do things at home and in your day-to-day lives, and to share that message with others. So I mean, if any of the kids in these classes go home and plant a pollinator garden, or go and even just explore their backyard, you can go in your backyard. I did this when I was a kid and spent 2 hours just trying to count the number of bugs and found 72 species in 2 hours. Right? These sort of things just make you feel really, really connected to nature. And so if you do them, let us know. Send us an email. We'd love to hear about stories like that. Peter already did such a great job in his presentation of highlighting some extra resources that you guys can check out. So I'm going to share some of those links when we're done. For now, everyone, I know we could talk all day, but we're getting out of time. So what I want to do is I'm going to demute every class's microphone. And so boys and girls, if you guys could all join me in saying a huge thank you to Peter for joining us today. You are all now demuted. Go for it. Thank you so much. Thank you, guys. Thank you to all our class for joining today. We really appreciate it. And again, I love this session because this is the perfect sort of session where you can go home and actually do something when you're done this program today. So we really encourage you to do that, and hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day till then. Peter, thank you so much for joining once again. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and thank you guys for such amazing questions. You guys are super brilliant, and it was really a pleasure to talk to you guys.
Awesome. Have a wonderful rest